Hi everyone, Steven Melton, Director of Partner Sales with Vega Cloud. Thanks everyone for joining. We're excited to have a short session talking with Rich Hoyer and Jenna Wright, particularly on a white paper that Rich put together around data sourcing for cloud and cost management. So we always like to kick things off with a fun intro, both Rich and Jenna. As a kid, what was your favorite technology? And I've got mine, but this is a goal to date you. So, Rich, you go first.
All right, I'm going to go first, and I'm really going to date myself. The technology would have to be Atari. I mean, the original, real Atari. I feel like I'm not a gamer at all, and I didn't stay with gaming after like the Nintendo years. But I feel like some of those simple games, the gameplay was actually a lot better than the new stuff with all kinds of crazy graphics. So now I'm really dating myself.
I agree. I'll date myself a little bit here, not quite that far back, but the original Nintendo was definitely my childhood game of choice, and playing Mario with my siblings, that I can just remember spending hours of that. And so with the recent game coming out, it's definitely been a throwback, and it has changed
those are
a lot.
both good. Rich, I would have thought you would have gone with an Abacus or something. So that's Atari. Hey, those are
now.
For those are both good. I'm tracking as well. I just remember, it's funny. While I loved video games, I played plenty of video games. I would say the Walkman, Sony, the old. I love that thing. So I'll peg that as mine. So all right, that's good. It's a good start. Thank you for sharing. Rich, hopefully maybe open us up. Again, I mentioned in starting. Really, it's opening up around the white paper that you recently put together. Maybe telling us the background on that, and what you're seeing, how that's helping and engaging with folks in their FinOps journey.
Yeah, sure. So I've been doing FinOps management consulting for a number of years now, and what we tend to encounter is sort of an evolution, beginning early in the period of cloud adoption for an enterprise, of the types of data sets and tools that they sort of take advantage of. And it sort of starts out, if you think about kind of a cloud native or a greenfield type of situation, of course, naturally, they're going to start off in the console. And it's in a simpler environment where they're not yet multi-cloud, so they start off immediately on GCP or AWS or Azure or whatever it is. That can work pretty well because you have a comparatively small number of people that are accessing the console. They can learn the navigation and the reporting structure fairly quickly. So it winds up working well for them. And the consoles, as we've seen over the years, have gotten better and better and better and better. In fact, AWS just announced some enhancements. I think it was today or this week. Now they have some resource level reporting, which is something that, as we get into it, you'll see that's something that is often a need for when you're diving deep into the data. So as they evolve in their cloud journey, a couple of things tends to happen. So one is the number of people needing to access the cloud cost data broadens as the organization grows. And now you have kind of this issue of more and more people having to learn how to navigate it, and figuring out how to move around and what the report structures are. The second thing is it's just very common for us to see clients that are sort of in the multi-cloud environment. And as they adapt another one or two more clouds, now you start to run into some limitations of relying entirely on the vendor's console. And the first of those is let's say we're multi-cloud and we have two or three clouds. Now you're going to have folks that are going to have to log into two or three different user interfaces and learn the different structure of navigating those user interfaces, and of course generate reports that one hopes would be more or less compatible, so that they can get an actual picture of the economics of the enterprise. So imagine now we're learning two or three different user interface structures. We're going to have to generate the same report, which could be as simple as, what did we spend on compute instances last month? 3 different ways. And now you run into a situation also where the vendors are going to oftentimes account for products and services in a different manner. A great example of that would be, a really simple, great example would be compute. So in AWS, as you know, you're looking at an hourly charge for an instance of X size running Y operating system, and that's all one hourly charge. When you look at, for example, GCP, you've got to charge for CPU, you've got to charge for RAM, and you've got a completely different line item for the operating system licensing fee. So imagine now you're going across these consoles, you've got to generate that report on GCP and try to meld it, if you will, and how you structure it so that you get the answer to the question, what did you spend on compute last month? And maybe more granularly, what did you spend on Red Hat instances, right? So you see this complexity grow using the consoles as the organizations grow, and they start to run into some limitations with the console itself.
Yeah, you really need that apples to apples comparison of just what am I spending and where, and just having that product grouping, kind of normalizing the data across the clouds really helps you get a sense of what am I spending where and how, and even how it's changing across the two clouds. And like you said, navigating between the different consoles and having to run one report one way and one console versus the other, then how do you feel confident that you're providing the same information across different clouds when you're
and meanwhile, we've probably all had this experience. Meanwhile, you've got finance and accounting figuratively or sometimes literally tapping their foot behind your chair. And we probably all heard this question. I don't understand why this is so hard, right? When I'm closing the books, everybody else can get me their numbers on the second of the month. Tell me why the heck this is so hard. And we know why it is, but we probably all had that experience.
Yeah, for sure. I was curious in that thought. Where do you see it being a strong requirement to have clear delineation on which clouds they're in and what percentages? I mean, would you say that, in most cases they're going to have a primary and then a secondary, and then now they're starting to dabble with the second or third, and that those questions, the necessity, right, and the importance is pretty much the same whether they're evenly divided or it's really more of a primary and secondary. What are your thoughts on that?
I think we most often see a primary and at least one secondary, and there are really three reasons why we see multi-cloud. The first one is going to be avoiding vendor lock-in, right? We've all heard this discussion about, I don't want to rely on just one. I want to have, some irons in the fire of another one so that we can, know that we have the capability to kind of move over. So that's kind of thing number one. Thing number two is, of course, the clouds have a little bit different focus and capabilities, and so they may have differing strengths across them. And the third would be licensing, specifically as it relates to Azure, right? So typically, if you have a Microsoft heavy shop, the way that the licensing gets set up, it's a little bit cleaner of a motion to move from the data center to Azure when you have a lot of licenses, as opposed to trying to navigate how that's going to translate to one of the other clouds. So it's really about vendor lock-in, avoiding vendor lock-in, some different capabilities, and then licensing. That's what we see.
Yeah, and you'll also sometimes have better pricing in one product area across the different clouds, and that really helps. Then it can help provide the entry into being multi-cloud, and then you do have that ability to build out in various clouds and go back and forth and transfer the data between the two as well, just for even data redundancy, that extra level of confidence that you have it in multiple places.
Yeah, that's a great point, and we always recommend that clients have a rolling practice of what we call workload placement. In other words, periodically doing an analysis and saying which cloud is the most cost effective. In fact, it's a best practice to do that between the data center and your clouds as well. You may recall there was an article a while back written by Andreessen Horowitz that talked about what they called repatriation. They were sort of positing that a lot of enterprises were finding cloud too expensive across any of the vendors and bailing and going back to the data center. And I actually wrote a rebuttal to that article that was fairly sharply worded. It was fun to write. But the point is, look, they're not wrong in saying this is analysis that people should be doing. So I agree with you that workload placement should be something that's ongoing, and it should include, are we still cost effective relative to the data center?
Yeah, another thing that comes to mind when you think about looking at top of funnel data and general reporting is, what about the focus for, granular level, more recess level reporting? How does that warrant into this conversation? Is it becoming more common, or is it more top level, help set the initiative? What are you seeing in that regard?
Yeah, along with that transition to growing, becoming multi-cloud, more people in the audience, that's one of the next things that happens, quite honestly, is you start to get into an investigatory pattern in the form of, and again, this is all stuff we probably all heard, in the form of finance or accounting coming and saying, how can it possibly cost this much, right? Why is it costing this much? And as soon as those questions start coming, that's really when you start to look to third-party commercial cost management tools like Vega to really start helping out. So when you move to a platform like that, you're going to get all the clouds in one pane of glass. You're going to get a standardized ability to report against the clouds in the form of a user interface that is now standard. So you're going to be training people to learn one user interface and move around that and just get the consolidated data. And suddenly you're going to have the ability to, literally run a report that says, what did we spend on compute last month? And you'll see it segmented by, it was X on AWS, it was Y on GCP, and it was Z on Azure. And again, coming back to the workload placement conversation, immediately that's going to be very helpful for getting a sense of kind of what the scale is, where the emphasis should be. But you're actually right, Steve, about getting granular. So where that really begins is with investigations of, compute costs really ballooned last month. Where did it happen? And sort of diving down into their means, you're going to need that resource level billing. As I mentioned, most of the consoles make that challenging if it's available at all. It's only recently available for AWS, and I think you get a limited amount through Cost Explorer, a limited number of days or weeks of data to get that. But those investigations almost always wind up drilling you down into the resource level. And another thing starts to happen at this point too, which makes a really strong case for a commercial, sort of third-party dedicated cost management platform. One of the things that starts to happen is the view of the cloud environment that an individual needs oftentimes drifts from what would be their sort of more natural IAM permissions or security permissions in the console itself. So concretely, if you imagine that sort of, Jane Smith has access to an environment, Jane has a little bit more of a product management role than a technical role. And so it's desirable, of course, keeping consistent with the principle of least privileges. We don't want to give Jane just root access to the AWS console. And now you run into these challenges where she needs a finance view or financial view of her cloud costs in her area. And that may span across IAM permissions that would be sort of difficult to cobble together. And so as soon as that decoupling of desirable security permissions occurs between that and the financial view the person needs, the cost management tooling has a huge advantage because you're able to set up a completely custom view that's only on the cost level, right? And so those views are easy to generate in one place. And now Jane can see exactly what she needs. You can edit that on the fly without this concern to involve security, to make the business case for those permissions, and so on. So those are the three first things that happen that cause these cost management platforms like Vega to be so valuable to the client. So the multi-cloud, getting it in one place, standardizing on operating it, the resource level reporting is another one. The differential permissions is the third. And then, of course, you're going to wind up with much enhanced reportability and recommendations that a lot of times are really considerably greater than what you find in the consoles. And once again, without the need to say, what are my recommendations for right sizing this month? Oh, darn it, let's go into 3 different consoles and learn what their trusted advisor looks like and so on. That's really what winds up happening. And these tools wind up being super valuable for those use cases.
Well, and really between the console, a perspective of a finance person versus a perspective of an engineer that's creating things, when you're looking in the console versus when you're using a platform or a tool to review the spend, you get the FinOps perspective of all the teams caring about what the spend is and being able to research it and look at it versus like in the console having to limit a financial person's access. You can really give both sides of the organization or all sides of the organization that view into where is the spend and why and what's driving those changes, and having that research tool to be able to look at it and then find those opportunities for savings, like you mentioned, and have that discussion across all sides of an organization of here's where we're seeing savings opportunities. Can we implement those? And because within FinOps, just having those conversations and having that visibility, the knowing what's happening and then being able to discuss why and where you're heading next for your spend.
That's 100% right. And what we've actually seen is that when you deploy a cost management platform, a multi-cloud cost management platform, and you're careful in constructing the views, meaning a technical owner is able to see exactly what she's spending and only what she's spending. We've seen many cases where the spend drops literally 10 or 15% overnight. And the conversations are really interesting because when they start logging on, you literally hear them say, I can't believe I was spending that, or, oh, I forgot all that stuff on. Some non-prod stuff, some POC stuff. We've heard that conversation a bunch of times. So you really can't over-index on the value of visibility and the interplay between visibility into spend and cost efficiency. The two things are totally intertwined. I often liken it to driving without your headlights on. If that technical owner is just in the console working on technical things and they're not often looking at costs or thinking about costs, when you give them highly focused reporting that only applies to their workloads, suddenly the headlights come on and, lo and behold, you stop running over a bunch of squirrels. The other thing that's really interesting about this that we found is when you deploy a cost management platform, we have found it's really, really, really important to drive adoption of it, to socialize very carefully with the broad possible audience what the tool is, what it can do for them, how to get on it. Because coming back to that anecdote of the 10 or 50% drop, guess what doesn't happen if nobody's logging on to it? And so one of the KPIs we encourage our clients to think about is literally it's a KPI to say what percentage of your technical owners are logging on to something like Vega once a week, or once, however often it is, to make sure that they're using the tool and driving that adoption.
The other thing that stands out, so it's interesting, right? If you start with the persona and you look at it from an operator's perspective and view, there is also then this piece of like them being able to replicate the organizational structure, right, by a business unit, or by how the actual company's making money by leveraging public cloud. So there's both the persona view, but then there's also the business view, right? Sometimes they correlate, sometimes they don't at all, right? So there's that piece that has to be, and then that again has to be replicated across each of those clouds as well. So maybe if there's any other points to share on that, but I would say that that's certainly something we're seeing as well.
Yeah, no, 100%. And actually, I just gave a talk on the relationship between the CTO office and the CFO office, and how sort of bifurcated that can be, and the need to get those two parties, talking more commonly. Normally, what we see, by the way, on the technical side is where the folks are using a cost management tool, and what we see is either the technical team or dedicated FinOps team is more or less translating the outputs of those platforms to put it into language that finance understands. So, in the most basic sense, it would literally be like closing the books every month. And, when they close the books, they want to get a reporting, in the form that's consistent with however they report, by business unit, by geo, whatever that is. And so those personas in accounting and finance really don't care about what EC2 is, or any of that. They just say, what did you spend? How much did it change? Segment it in this way. So we typically see that's the boundaries of where people are interacting with either console or cost management, in our experience, kind of ends on the technical side. And then you've got some number of parties. It might be some poor technical souls that have it dumped in their lap to do the reporting, or better yet, as the organization continues to mature, they're going to start having FinOps practitioners that are dedicated. Oftentimes today, full-time. We see large enterprises have 2 or 3 full-time FinOps practitioners now that are doing rolling efficiency checks, but they're also there to do the reporting, each period, and also real time.
Yeah, and things like cost allocation that you can't, where you're in something like the console, you're looking at spend by specific groups, but then those top level billing items that aren't getting allocated out from within a billing console, you want that cost allocation within your platform to be able to see how the spend is broken down across groups. And then even there are some areas of spend that multiple groups would want visibility into. You might have one account that is being utilized by multiple groups, and so you want visibility into that across several different users and the ability to review it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it's fair to say that literally every client I've had since I got into this work years ago has somewhere in their organization something I call an account table. And the account table is almost always some kind of mapping, a many to one mapping between cloud vendor accounts and some kind of business unit. So if you imagine somebody who's having AWS and they have whatever 30 AWS accounts, it's almost always the case that some, 5 of those are going to map to business unit X, and some other number go to business unit Y. And those account tables are always really important to understand because they speak to exactly the challenge you just mentioned. Is when people need to close the books every month, a lot of times there is data that is not present in the form of an account table like that in the native billing data, nor would it be. I mean, why would AWS know that, department X maps to these accounts? You can do things like cost allocation tagging, but a lot of times these account tables are really, really large. And so when we start off with a client, getting them set up in FinOps, the first thing that happens after the kickoff call of you get people in the room and you say, here's who we are, here's what we're here to do. The next question I ask is, can I meet the person who closes the books every month on cloud spend? And I literally say that because I want to understand the process. And they say, well, what do you mean? And I say, well, the first thing we need to do is hunt down and kill any post-processing that we possibly can. And what I mean by post-processing, again, is the process of going into that data and merging the account table. And usually it's in Excel, which is, I love Excel, nothing against Excel, but it is not a best practice to close cloud financial books in a spreadsheet. Because what happens when people are doing that, first of all, it's soul crushingly dull work. But when they wind up doing like, VLOOKUPs across an account table and they're allocating things like, oh, support just got chucked in the master payer account, we need to allocate that out. These are all things that need to be done that give a different view of spend than the vendor had, right? And so we want to understand what that process is, because usually there's a sort of cauliflower growth of post-processing that's going on in spreadsheets. And again, apart from being soul crushingly dull, the other reason we really, really hate it is if you zoom back out, what's actually happening is the only people who have visibility into the real economics of the business are the recipients of that spreadsheet. And usually it's going around by email. And we hate that because, like we talked about earlier, when you have a cost management tool, the democratization of the visibility into spend in and of itself results in improvements in efficiency. Well, the same is true when we're looking at the chargeback, because now we want those business unit owners to have real-time visibility to say, how are we doing this week? How are we doing today? How do we do yesterday? We don't want them to say, it's the 5th of the month, I just got the spreadsheet, open it and have their heart sink at what happened, right? Now we've got to try to triage something that happened 3 weeks ago. So that post-processing has to be hunted down and destroyed as fast as you can. In a perfect world, we really want the client to remediate that data in the cloud billing data. So in a perfect world, there's some way to literally putting into something like cost management tags, the information that's in the account table. In the real world, that's oftentimes a challenge. And what it gives rise to is the need for sort of the third of the possible data sets. And that's going to happen when you're in this situation where you have third-party data sets that you want to integrate with the billing data. Cloud cost management tooling often can help with that. They often have features that look a little bit like synthetic tagging. But when you really need a large data set, if that account table is really, really big, or, and this is the critical distinction, if you feel like you don't know what tags are going to help you remediate the tagging in the cloud platform itself, you want a staging environment that's where you're not affecting the production environment, because now your cost management tooling is production, right? People are on it, they're using it, they're getting benefit from it. I need a sandbox where I can say, we have post-processing going on. It's in spreadsheets. This is bad. We need to fix this. Let's experiment and find out what metadata improvements are going to get us out of that mode. And for that, we recommend actually using a relational database. So all 3 of the cloud providers usually have large billing files that you can pull into something like Redshift on AWS or BigQuery on GCP, et cetera. And that allows you to expand the schema of the data. It allows you to integrate those other data sets. And again, they're varied. The account table is only one of them that I could point to. There are all kinds of other things you might want to integrate there. to gain those new insights, to figure out how you want to remediate the metadata in the environment. And the other real benefit this gives you is the ability to really dive down at the resource level in a very efficient, fast way. So you could literally say, these 5 instances are causing these data transfers that are causing the cost to be that high. They're really good for doing that kind of thing because, again, they're massive data sets. So those are the pros to doing this. The cons are, I don't say cons, but one of the limitations doing this is a couple of things. One is, depending on the cloud provider, the pipeline to get the billing files into a database can be cumbersome. And I'd specifically kind of throw AWS under the bus here. Getting the cost and usage report into Redshift is not that trivial of a thing, and they haven't made it easier in the recent years, which I wish they would. And it's a gigantic data set, so you're going to need something like Redshift to do that. So you're going to have some involvement from the tech side to do that. Second thing goes without saying, you're going to have SQL skills to really benefit from this data, to write those queries, to integrate the data sets. And then the third thing, of course, is it's not going to do anywhere near as well as a commercial cost management platform in democratizing the data, because you can put in a Vega and you can give everybody logins, you can integrate the authentication, immediately give them the views they need in a very quick way in a consumable environment. We all know that databases are not everybody's bag, and so you're going to need a BI layer to connect to that to make it useful for normal people, right? I don't really want to go across my whole organization and say, we're going to have to buy, a ton of Tableau licenses or something like that. Tableau is a great tool, but, to deploy that across the org is nowhere near as efficient as just using something like Vega, right? And you'd have to train them on BI tools if they don't know how to use them, et cetera, et cetera. So think of the database as being really at the core of the FinOps team itself for investigation, for a staging environment for remediation, and potentially for ongoing reporting. But again, for all the reasons we've talked about, let's get that data either into a Vega or into the tagging so that we democratize it as much as possible. Because again, the view of that database is going to be somewhat limited.
Yeah, that line item level detail is fantastic when you're researching something, but using a platform to get to the resource level detail can be great, because then you can find out what's driving the changes in cost. But yeah, at least having one person that you already have the data, you're creating the data if it's going into a platform or a tool. So you have that billing level data that you can have someone getting in there and viewing it and looking at it and looking at those massive files and so many. It's so much data that the majority of people, they don't want to look at it, but it is there if someone does need to look at it, and that is a great resource.
Yeah, and you get into a rhythm dealing with them. Obviously, every client that we get, we immediately go right for the raw billing files. If they have a cost management tool already, if adoption is low, we're going to work very hard on socialization and getting adoption high and getting people logging onto it. But we're still going to be diving into the database for our own kind of FinOpsy purposes, and that's a good fit. I mean, some of us geek out on the data and investigating it, but we're in that rhythm of writing queries, and we like looking at plain text files and queries, but not everybody is quite that quirky. So.
No, that's great. Obviously, I'm being mindful of times too. I want to make sure we're tracking. I think that looking over at the points we were driving on, were there any final thoughts or additional insights that each you wanted to share to maybe kind of help wrap the discussion?
I mean, I would say from my standpoint, for organizations to know where they are in that journey and to have an honest conversation with themselves when they're reaching a limitation of one or more of the options, and act early and often to get tooling in there that's helpful. I think that would be the final thing. I think as a large enterprise, it's generally a recommendation that all 3 of these be made use of, right? And that's the perfect world. You have a FinOps team that's digging into the raw billing files. You got a well deployed cost management tool that's there, and you're remediating data as close to the source as you can. Again, ideally in the form of metadata that's in the cloud provider. Next in line would be, let's use those synthetic tagging features of the commercial tool as much as we possibly can, and only have lookups and things like that done in the database as a last resort. Because again, think of it as a narrowing cone of exposure to the data. the base of the cone, the widest exposure is going to be the cost management platform. Then there's going to be the console because of IAM limitations, right? And then you're going to have the database at the end, where really what's actually happening is some third parties in the org are coming to FinOps and saying, please investigate this. And they're the ones that dig into and kick out the report. That's really usually the way the workflow looks like in a perfect world.
Yeah, and all three are useful and have a place. And it's also where you're at on your journey of getting into your FinOps data. But yeah, that you're looking at it, you're reviewing it, you have the appropriate parties reviewing it, talking about it, discussing where your costs are and why, and then diving into the details where it's necessary, and have the appropriate people looking at the appropriate things.
Great. No, thank you very much for sharing the insights. We'll make sure to capture questions and the inquiry from the listeners as well, but I know it was super helpful. Everyone's busy, so appreciate your time and look forward to following up in the next discussion.
Thanks so much.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Cheers.